Okay, in this video, we are going to go over how to choose the best way to solve a quadratic equation. And it so happens that you choose your way based on your situation, like a lot of other things in math class. So the first way that you can solve a quadratic is by factoring. And just to remind ourselves, when we solve something, we're isolating the variable. In the case of quadratics, you're looking for the zeros of the function, right? Where the parabola crosses the x-axis and if it crosses the x-axis. And we'll learn about that in a bit. So you are only going to solve by factoring if you can take one look at your quadratic and within 30 seconds be able to factor it. Pretty much you're only going to choose this method if you can do it in your head. If you can look at this like x squared minus 3x plus 2, oh yeah, if you multiply 1 and 2 together, you can get 2, -1 and -2. And if you add them together, you get -3. So you see how quick that was? That's the only time you're going to choose this method. So factor by whatever method you like. And then step 2 is set each factor equal to 0 and solve for x. Now you can skip this step if you can just look at the binomial and quickly see what number you could plug in for x and make that factor equal to 0. So in this case, x is equal to 1 and x is equal to 2. Alrighty? So that's solving by factoring. If you don't have a b term, if you do not have a linear term at all, go ahead and take the square root. That's pretty quick, actually. So what do we do when we do that? Well, step 1, we isolate the squared term. And step 2, we take the square root of both sides, remembering two important things. Number 1, remember the plus and minus, because you can get a square by multiplying two negative numbers together, right? Or two positive numbers together. Like if you square positive 2, you get 4. If you square negative 2, you still get 4. And then you have to simplify completely. So you have to simplify your roots, all right? And we learned how to do that a while ago. Now you know why we did. So let's take this binomial up here, this equation, 2x squared minus 6 equals 0. So I'm going to isolate the squared term first by adding 6 to both sides. Okay, which will give me 2x squared equals 6. And then I'm going to also divide both sides by 2. Now I have what I want. I have the x squared term all by itself, and 6 divided by 2 is 3. So at this point, I take the square root of both sides, and I don't forget my plus and my minus. So x equals plus or minus the square root of 3. So what does this mean? This means x equals the positive square root of 3, and x also equals the negative square root of 3. So there you have it. Take the square root when you don't have a linear term. Moving on to the next one. Okay, so you've got a weird looking or a scary looking quadratic, it's got large numbers, or it's really obvious that you either can't factor it or why would you want to? It's going to be a mess. Go directly to the quadratic formula. Remember, it comes from completing the square. So yeah, you can solve a quadratic by completing the square, but it doesn't take very long for that process to get really messy, really fast. So why not just use the quadratic formula? So here is a quadratic. I made it up on the spot, and as luck would have it, it's kind of weird. But this is how you solve a quadratic by using the quadratic formula. Here is the quadratic formula. I will always give it to you. I don't believe in making you memorize things. You know that about me. So, but here it is, negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. Step 1, list your coefficients. Go through these steps. Don't skip them. You will be glad that you didn't. So our A coefficient is positive 5, our B coefficient is negative 7, and our C coefficient is 12. All right? So this is another thing I strongly suggest that you not skip step 2. And step 2 is plug all of the numbers into the formula before you start doing anything. That way, it's easy to go back and see where you might have made a mistake. So I plugged negative 7 in for B. Notice how that's going to make that number positive. Okay, that negative belongs there. You can't change it. You're plugging numbers in. Plus or minus the square root of negative 7 squared minus 4 times A, which is 5, times C, which is 12, all divided by 2 times 5. Okay? Third step, simplify completely. Okay? That means you have to simplify your square roots and factor out your I for the square root of negative 1 if you end up having complex solutions, which we actually did end up having. So this is how I strongly suggest that you do it. You do what's under the square root sign first. Okay, so I did that. I simplified that first. I've got 49 minus 240, which turns out to be a negative 191. I looked up 191 is a prime number. So, but I do have a negative underneath the square root sign, which means I have to simplify that by factoring out the square root of negative 1, right? Which is the symbol I. Always write your I in front of the square root sign so you don't lose it. So now I can be done because I cannot simplify these I cannot simplify these solutions anymore. 7 is not divisible by 10. There's no number outside of the square root that I could factor out with the 7 and the 10. And I've got my I. So my two solutions, if you plotted this quadratic into Desmos, you would find that it is a floating parabola. We'll learn about that later when we graph. And here are your solutions. 7 plus I root 191 divided by 10, and 7 minus I root 191 divided by 10. Hey, pretty cool, huh? See you in the next video.